What we're going to spend some time looking at is the situation in Ukraine, a bit of background about why Ukraine is so important to Russia. And then when we've looked at that, see how that fits in with, as Brother Ed's hinted in his prayer, Daniel's image, the forming of the 2 feet. And then we can look at the events that have been happening in the past few weeks and months in the Middle East, in Iraq in particular, and the Pope's visit to Israel. And then finally, just a few brief slides on Britain and the EU.
To the man. And let's see if we can...
So, the key reading, if we were going to have a reading, would be Daniel chapter 2, which God revealed to Nebuchadnezzar the king what will happen in the latter days, and we know that we're living in the latter days. So, although we understand the build-up of the image over the many millennia, yet we know it has a latter day fulfilment, and it has never stood up upon its feet in any time in its history. But what we're seeing in the forming of the 2 feet, in order that the image, the kingdom of men, might stand up in defiance of the things of God, and the characteristic of all those nations was that they came against Israel. They had dominion over Israel. And the whole purpose of this kingdom of men standing upon its feet is to go to the Middle East against Israel, to destroy Israel as a nation, and in their eyes to wipe out anything to do with Judaism, and to replace it with their own false ideas. But we know that Scripture tells us that that image is to be hit by the little stone. Shouldn't disappear quite as quickly as that, but it will be wiped off the map, ground to powder, and then will be replaced by the kingdom of God, which will fill the whole earth. And it's interesting to witness the resurgence of Russia at this time. We know that Russia...
by the way, let me just go back.
Yeah, plays a very important role in the gathering of the nations to come against Israel. And a very famous quotation from Elpis Israel 160 odd years ago. Brother Thomas says, "The future movements of Russia are notable signs of the times, because they are predicted in the scriptures of truth. When Russia makes its grand move for the building up of its image empire, then let the reader know that the end of all things as at present constituted is at hand. The long expected but stealthy advent of the King of Israel will be on the eve of becoming a fact." And so it's exciting, isn't it, to see Russia rebuilding her power again. Because this, we know, we've been waiting for a long time this to happen, and now it's beginning to happen in our days. Now, the Ukraine forms a very important role in the history of Russia. Ukraine was the origin of Russia. This is where Russia came from. This is where the Russian Orthodox Church had its origin, in Kiev, in Ukraine. And if we start at the beginning and go to the book of Genesis, where we have the listing of the sons of Noah and then his grandsons, we know that Europe and across to China was populated by the sons of Japheth, and the 7 sons of Japheth are listed there. And it was by these that the earth was repopulated after the flood. And we're particularly interested in Tyrus, the one at the end, the youngest one, because Tyrus gave his name to the area around the Black Sea and the Ukraine. If we look at an ancient map, then what now is called the River Dniester used to be called the River Tyras. And so we can see, it directly takes its link from the grandson of Noah, Tyrus. And still to the day is Terastopol on the river Tyras. That still exists. And Herodotus says that these people that settled in this region are the people of Taurus. And one can see that the Taurus and Tyrus are very similar names, and we know how names do change, that the English come from the Angles, but we can see the connection between Tyrus and Taurus that Herodotus called us. But the interesting thing was, Herodotus tells us that the Tauri were the first inhabitants to go and inhabit Crimea. And another very ancient historian says that the Tauri were expressly called Ross. And again, it's not difficult to see how Tyrus, and emphasise the last part, Ross, and that was the name that in his day they were known by. They were called the Rus. And Byzantine writers give them a much longer title and call them the Tauri Scythii, because the Scythians were from this region, and there were Scythians descended from Magog as well as Scythians descended from Tyrus. So to distinguish them, these were the Tauri Scythians. And again, this is a modern Russian historian, Gregov, says the Tauri Scythians call themselves Rus. And my ancient Encyclopaedia Britannica, Russia is derived through Rossia, from the Slavonic Rus or Ros. And I believe that these are the descendants of Tyrus, and gave his name to this area. Now, the area as a kingdom didn't come into being until about AD 870. Due to the amalgamation of a city in the north and a city in the south, initially at war, but that very quickly became a peace between these two important cities, and the latter, Kiev, became the most important one. This region flourished. It was on the trade route that the Vikings had to come down to Constantinople, and it was the one of these kings, Igor. Again, this Jewish Russian historian says the Soviet historians look upon Igor as the true beginning of the Russian princely line. So the Russians take their origins from this Kievan Rus way back in the 870s. And various kings here. The last one, Vladimir, was the one who was converted to Christianity, the Greek Orthodox, and he brought Christianity to Kiev. He personally supervised the baptism, and they were actually immersed in water, from what I make out, baptised the inhabitants of Kiev. And so the Greek Orthodox Church was taken into Kiev, and then from that developed ultimately in breakaway the Russian Orthodox Church. So Ukraine plays a big role in Russian history. And if we just go to the height of the kingdom, when it was very extensive, and that's where Ukraine is at the moment there, that was it in its greatest zenith. But then things broke up. The Mongols swept in from the east and pushed them back and shrank, and eventually Kiev itself was taken by the Mongols in 1240, and so they had to move their centre, well, especially the church, the Russian church, moved up to Vladimir, and then finally to Moscow, and that's what gave Moscow its importance, because this is where the church decided to make its centre, and then the Russian Empire, as it were, then moved and amalgamated around Moscow, moved up northward. And subsequent history in AD 1400s, you can see the outline of Kiev today, partly in Poland, partly in the Mongol area. Go on another 200 years, again mainly Poland, but in the south it was the Ottoman Empire. Go on to the 1800s, it's now in Russian hands. And then at the beginning of the 1900s, again in Russian hands. And then in 1917, with the Russian Revolution, Ukraine declared independence, but soon after it was conquered by the Soviets in 1919 and became the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. In World War II, Ukraine came under Nazi control, but by the end of the war, the Russians had regained it. There was a lot of bloodshed, very bitter times in Ukraine during that war. So in 1991, when the Soviet Empire fell, Ukraine once more became independent. But we'll just look at Crimea, because Crimea has obviously been in the news a lot. Crimea had a different fate. Crimea was under the Russian-Soviet control. It wasn't under Ukrainian control until 1954. And part of a celebration of the 300 years when under the Treaty of Pereslav, the Ukrainians and the Russians had joined forces 300 years later. To celebrate that anniversary, Khrushchev decided to hand back Crimea to the Ukrainians. And because it was under the Soviet, it didn't really make much difference at all. But of course, when the Soviet fell, it had very strong repercussions. So that was back in 1954 when Crimea came back under the control of the Ukraine. Another important, and that was a poster showing that the Ukrainians and the Russians, shoulder by shoulder, celebrating that anniversary. 24 years later came the anniversary of the Christianization of the Ukraine and Russia. So this was a contemporary magazine in 1998. It's finally come, the observance that millions of Ukraine by the Russian and Russian Christians have been waiting for, the millennium of the Christianization of Rus, when the Grand Prince Vladimir ordered the people of his kingdom to be baptized into the Orthodox Christian faith, and personally oversaw the baptisms of the majority of the people in Kiev, the capital of his realm. And it added, and it was quite interesting, but the arrival and celebration of this millennium is heavily laden with irony. Remember, this has been written in 1988. Probably the chief irony is the fact that the Soviet Union, a zealously atheistic government, is endorsing, even funding and promoting the most spectacular of the many events worldwide that are being dedicated to this millennium of Christianity in Rus. Well, that was 1998, and just 3 years later the Soviet fell. And all the coloured states here, which had been either largely or loosely under the control of Russia, the Soviet, all broke away. And Putin described this breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991 as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century, talking about the 20th century. Now, bearing in mind, in the 20th century we had World War I and World War II and the Holocaust and that, what Putin honed in on was that the worst event in that 20th century was the breakup of the Soviets. And so you can see his thinking. If he describes that as being the worst event, then he's going to take steps to try and change things back. And things have changed very much in Russia since the breakup in 1991. Chiefly is the reinstatement of religion, and one sees very many pictures of all state occasions that the Russian priests and the Russian leaders work hand in hand, and see many pictures of Putin kissing icons and being at services, something which almost unbelievable 30 years ago. But this is the situation now, and very important, because we know that church and state are going to work together to gather the nations to come against Israel. So Putin's goal is to roll back the clock, as it were. He regards himself as one of the old Tsars, the Caesars. And this chap writing Reuters says of Putin sees himself as an invaluable historic figure who shall be responsible for the upholding the pursuit of Russian greatness, no matter what law or border stands in his way. Moscow is preparing for a lengthy confrontation with the West. After years of defending the status quo, Putin seems to have decided that he is better served by overturning it. Russia has a genius for revolutions, but while the earlier revolutions were about changing the leadership of the country, Putin's revolution aims to correct the order around him. And so he is increasing his military spending, and for the first time now it's exceeded that of the United States for the first time since 2003. And I like what it says on this, is a Turkish paper, which is a big sign that Russia is getting ready for some expected tough days in the near future. Again, with having seized Crimea, Russia is spending a lot of money on developing her fleet in the Black Sea. We know that she is to come forth with many ships, and so this is part of that process of Russia building up her military again. Now, as far as the Ukraine is concerned, the problem for the Ukrainians lies in the east of the country. And these, all the places in white, are towns which have wanted to have independence or link up with Russia. And Donetsk there is the second largest city in Ukraine. It's their coal mining centre and industrial heartland. And they have already, back in May, had a referendum and have declared that they want to become part of Russia. And these are in the extreme east of the country. We just put the map back on there. You can see that that's the region there in the east. Now, if we overlay that with a map which shows the percentage of Russian-speaking people, you can see why that part is so much wanting to join up with Russia. Because nearly 87% Russian is their natural language. They don't speak Ukraine, they speak, majority of them, in Russian, and in the south 82%. In the centre there, Russian is a minority, but 46%. And then as you can go westward there, 24% in the centre, and only 3% speak Russian over there. So you can see there's a very strong draw on this eastern side to join up with Russia. They regard themselves as Russian people. And of course, what Putin wants is to absorb this country back under his control. Now, he probably would be quite happy not to bother with the West there, but he would very much like to have all that back under his control. And as we know, Crimea down in the south has already fallen into Russian hands. Very crafty steps that he took to get control of the region. And they are in talks with the Chinese to build a bridge. There's quite a narrow little gap there, and they want the Chinese to build a bridge so that Crimea can be attached to Russia, because at the moment, and because of the problems with the Ukrainians, they have to come by ship and boat everything in. But if they could just build across there, then that would anchor, as it were, Crimea into Russian territory. Now, the Sevastopol is where they have their deep water ports. This is where, for many years, the Russians have had their navy. The importance of Sevastopol is it really is the only warm water port that the Russians have that doesn't freeze up in the wintertime. All the other ports that she has to the north freeze up in the wintertime. So she has concentrated much of her naval efforts in building up her ships in Sevastopol. The other big prize as far as Russia is concerned is that all around this maritime region there is vast amounts of energy. It's been likened to the equivalent of the North Sea reserves. And if we just put this map on, before April of this year, there's Crimea, part of Ukraine, and the Ukrainians said, well, all this is our territory, and Russia, and that was her maritime region. But as I say, this is a very rich region. and now she has seized, then, she has taken really the whole region there. And as a spin-off to that, not only has she now access to that wealth, she's wanting to promote the building of the South Stream pipeline, which originally had to skirt around because that was Ukrainian and she couldn't cross Ukrainian territory. She had to come down and planned it to come into Turkish territory and across there. Now, of course, she can just build a much shorter pipeline and cut out a fair section there. So it's important to Russia. And as I say, because Ukraine is the birthplace of Russia, Russia feels she has a very strong claim to that area. Now we know that they've just had elections in the Ukraine, and the Petro Poroshenko is nicknamed the Chocolate King because, as well as being a politician, he is a billionaire businessman, and chocolates and sweets and that kind of thing is what he's made his money on. Now, he is quite interested in building bridges back to Russia, but he is also determined that Ukraine should be linked to the EU. And of course, that is why Russia continues to undermine him. He has tried to bring the East under control, but there's been quite a lot of bloodshed there. And back a week ago, we saw these pictures of these Russian tanks crossing from Russia into Ukraine to support the eastern Ukrainians in their rebellion against the government in Kiev. And then 2 days later they shot down that transport plane which was carrying Ukrainian troops. All 49 died, and that was really shocked the whole country. But Putin has been keeping up the pressure, not only supplying what these rebels need, and it was a Russian anti-aircraft missile that brought the plane down, but he's also using oil and gas as his weapon, which he's used many times before. And this is a cartoon which was on Milestones about 8 years ago, I think, but still applies. Gas prices, back in 2010, the Ukrainians negotiated a special discount with Russia to bring the price down to $234 for 1,000 cubic metres of gas. And that discount was because they had made an agreement for Russia to continue to lease the site at Sebastopol, the naval base, for another 25, 30 years. And because they had agreed to that, then Putin gave them a discount on their gas. So they were paying $234. Well, when this year Sebastopol came into Russian hands, Putin said to Gazprom, well, they can't have their 30% discount now because we're not actually renting it off them. We now possess it. And there was another discount that they'd had. So suddenly the price leaps up to $485, doubles. Well, a lot of argument and discussion, and the amount of money that Ukraine owes for the gas it's had in the past is absolutely staggering. According to Gazprom, anyway, they owe $4.5 billion in back payments. So Russia is saying, look, you've got to pay your debts. If you pay up your debts, then we'll be very kind. We won't charge you $485. We'll bring it down to $385. But the Ukrainians, well, they made their offer and said, well, we'll only pay $326. And so stalemate. So on Monday, the taps were turned. Now, it isn't actually true that the supplies were turned off, because running through Ukraine are the major pipelines which take Russian gas through Ukraine and onwards into Poland and Romania and Hungary and all along there. So what Russia has done is to reduce the amount of gas that goes through those pipes by the amount that Ukraine normally takes out. So Ukraine is in a bit of a difficult situation. She has in the past illegally tapped into these pipelines and drawn out gas, and she'll probably do that again. But she has built up reserves. It is the summertime. She says that they have 10 months' supply of gas. And downstream there shouldn't be any problems unless something happens. And a pipeline was blown up day before yesterday, but we shall see. But at the moment the pressure is not on the downstream side. They're still getting their gas, but Ukraine officially is not getting any gas. Ukraine has over the past few years been finding alternative supplies. And it'll be interesting to see just what happens. But the crunch will come in the winter time, no doubt. But it's interesting to see the effect this has had on their currency, the hryvnia, well, I can't even pronounce it, but whatever it is there. You can see that's a year ago. This is just spanning this day before yesterday. So it's dropped incredibly. And that is why our brothers and sisters in Ukraine need our financial help. Because the cost of living has just gone through the roof. And because of all the problems that are happening there, a lot of the banks aren't operating, a lot of the businesses aren't operating. Life is very difficult for our brothers and sisters out there at this time. In Crimea, it's still chaos, apparently, because now, instead of Ukrainian law applying to land transactions and whatever, it's all Russian laws. Russian passports, Russian driving licences. It's just put a whole spanner in the works, and it's taken quite a time to swing them from a Ukrainian outlook to a Russian outlook, so things are pretty grim there. But I don't think there are any brothers and sisters on the Crimea itself. But what all that is leading to is this movement of the nations into their right feet. And it's quite interesting to see how, over our lifetime, things have changed. If we just go back to 1991, which lifetime a lot of people here, not everybody. That was the EU. That was the Soviet Union when it had broken up in 1991. And the EU has been creeping eastwards. Big explosion in 2004 when it expanded rapidly, and now in 2014 with 28 members it has come right up to the borders of Russia at the top there and up to Ukraine and Belarus. Now Russia hasn't stood idly by, and what Russia is planning is their equivalent of the EU. Is developing a customs union, and that it will involve Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, and as from a couple of months ago, Crimea. And these nations, just at the end of last month, on the 29th of May, signed the paperwork for this to come into being next year, the Eurasian Economic Union, which hopefully, what they're hoping is that more will come and join this economic union. As I say, it will be their equivalent of the EU. And they're hoping that countries like Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and Armenia will join. They wanted Ukraine, they thought Ukraine would be one of the founder members, because the president up till February time when he fled off to Russia was very pro-Russian, but of course that's all got scuppered. But Putin still dreams of Ukraine and Moldova, and Georgia will come and join in. Now, we know from Bible in hand that these countries, this is where we expect this is how it is at the moment, this is what we would expect to happen, that countries like Ukraine, and those will be absorbed into the Russian side rather than the EU side. And it's an interesting time in the history of the world when nations see the benefit of joining up and forming bigger blocs because it gives them more power. And because of the things that were happening in Russia, the New Statesman had this as its cover on the 28th of March, with the Russian bear asserting herself, and you see the arrows going down into the Middle East and into Ukraine, down into Africa. And if you've got good eyesight, there's Cameron and Obama and Merkel standing there wondering just how to answer this aggressiveness now on the part of Putin. Is it time to rearm? And I think, yes, we will see a period when the nations will rearm to face this threat that they perceive of Russia. Well, we know in the scheme of things we are in this iron and clay feet being prepared for this image, and there has to be an eastern foot and there has to be a western foot. And we know, I've knocked out the scriptures here because we know them, so I can put other things in. But we know from scriptures that this strange mixture of iron and clay is one that doesn't really work. Iron we associate with Rome, Rome military and Rome ecclesiastical. And clay we associate with men. Adam was formed from clay, humanism. And we're in this strange mixture where we have weak and strong. We have the authoritarianism and humanism standing side by side. We see the authority of Rome in the churches, very much in the East, in Russia. The church plays a very big role in everyday life in Russia and has brought the Russians together in a way which the communists never succeeded in doing. And we know that that's the Pope's dream, that he can mirror that kind of thing in Europe. And we know that he will succeed. We've gone through a period of humanism, leaving religion out of everyday life, but I think we're going to find a reaction against that, and people are going to come back to having a church power there. And Iron 2 speaks of military might, and we see the Russians are rebuilding their army, and I think that we shall also see on the other side the EU. She's been trying to come together with a unified army and not succeeded because Britain really isn't very interested in it. And Britain taken out of the way, then we shall see a regrowth of that. But in the spirit of Joel, the weak nations are saying, let's be strong. We're going to have a period of warfare, and so we're going to beat pruning hooks into spears. And this is the time period that we are at. And so what we've seen before our eyes is the shaking of the nations into their appropriate feet. So what is interesting is, where is the dividing line going to be between the eastern foot and the western foot? Where are the boundaries going to run? Well, we can only be guided by history. Back in the original division of the feet, the two legs, then it ran up through the Balkan region there, and the area to the north was lay outside the Roman Empire, mainly barbarian country, and so we don't have a definitive dividing line, but it makes sense that it will run up there, in which case that's Ukraine there, Romania and Bulgaria, which at the present are in the EU, I believe have got to come out, as to Greece. Greece is attached to the wrong leg, as is Cyprus, and eventually Turkey, of course, has got to be brought in. When Gog comes down, she will take Constantinople as part of her movement southwards. And so I believe that we shall see a division there, and so I expect the map to end up something like this, with Britain by that time out of it, and Greece and Cyprus and Turkey and that being in this camp here. But at the same time as we see the shaping of the 2 feet, those feet aren't just detached from the rest of the image. There are going to be 2 legs, 2 thighs, a body and a head of gold. And what is so fascinating is to see at this time what we see now with the shaping of the 2 feet, we're also seeing the shaping of the 2 thighs. Now go back in history, the Greek Empire, remember how the Greek Empire was divided into a king of the north and a king of the south in relation to the nation of Israel. And again, we're seeing exactly the same kind of shaping up in the Middle East of Iran to the north and the Saudis to the south there, forming a north-south thighs, as well as we've got the east-west feet. So if we just now jump to what is happening in the Middle East, that's a map that tells us of the Shia and the Sunni split, because this is the whole basis of what is happening, has been happening for the past few years. Iran is very heavily, where's around there, 90% Shia. Iraq is predominantly Shia, but to a lesser extent, 63%. And apart from Yemen and Lebanon there, the rest are predominantly Sunni Muslims. And tremendous differences, it's a Protestant Roman Catholic kind of division between the two. And the Arab Spring has been very much influenced by the Shia-Sunni split. Now, what we've been seeing in the past few weeks and few days is the quite phenomenal expansion of this situation, the ISIS in Iraq. Now, that's a typo on the map. That should be 12, because all this is 10, 11, 12, so we haven't even got to the 21st, so it can't be showing the situation then, but just reverse those two. So this is now showing that this ISIS power, we'll look at who they are, now control a lot of Syria and all down here, almost to the doors of Baghdad. With the Syrian war over here, the Syrian war has now entered its 4th year. President Assad has been elected. He now has another 7 years in office. He's been brutally using chemical weapons and shrapnel-filled bombs to decimate his people. He's still clinging to power. It's estimated that 170,000 people have died, though I did see another estimate which put it nearly 250,000. But we know there's about 3 million have fled from Syria and 4 million have been displaced within Syria. It's a humanitarian disaster. And to begin with, there were lots of opposition parties trying to dislodge Assad. But as time's gone on, those parties have amalgamated. And what really has sprung out is this ISIS power now have the main power and have taken, there's lots of oil fields and that in the Euphrates region there. They have emerged as a very strong power. So who are ISIS? What does ISIS stand for? ISIS is an Islamist state in Iraq and Syria, or sometimes instead of Syria it'll have Al-Sham, which is the ancient name for Syria. You'll also see it under ISIL, which is the exactly the same, but instead of saying Syria, it's saying Levant. Now, the Levant is the region really from Syria down to Israel, across to Iraq. Sometimes it goes down into Egypt and up into Turkey, but mainly the eastern Mediterranean lands as they go along. So this is an Islamic state that they are wanting to set up. This grouping started 10 years ago to support Al-Qaeda and they were in Iraq, fighting in Iraq, and they are Sunni Muslims. Now, Saddam Hussein and most of his henchmen were also Sunni Muslims in a country where the majority was Shia. So Saddam Hussein had to use pretty brutal methods in order to retain power of his particular men who were Sunni, the minority in the country. So when the Americans came along and swept out the Sunnis, then ISIS was there to help Al-Qaeda fight against the British and the American. But just last year, 2013, there was a falling out between Al-Qaeda, the present Al-Qaeda leader, and the ISIS leaders, and Al-Qaeda tried to outlaw them. But they have gone from strength to strength. And there was an interesting article in the Guardian paper. Come on. It soon became clear, it says, that in less than 3 years, ISIS has grown from a ragtag band of extremists to perhaps the most cash-rich and capable terror group in the world. A bit frightening. They took Mosul, the second biggest city in Iraq, last week. They plundered the banks, and it's estimated that that gave them £1.5 billion just from the money in the banks. They have been looting archaeological sites, and just from one site in Syria, it's been estimated they made $36 million, and they've been looting lots of different sites. So they've been funding their activities by obtaining that. And they've also had countless billions of pounds from the Syrian oil fields, which they now control. So they've got a vast amount of money and are very strict in their wanting to apply Shia law. They use chopping off hands and beheadings and hangings and crucifixions to bring terror to the people that they are wanting to control. So when they came to Mosul on June the 12th, which was mainly Shia people there, the soldiers just shed their uniforms and fled in terror because they knew what would happen to them. And we know, we've seen pictures in the papers how 1,700 of them didn't get out in time, and in scenes which are very reminiscent of what the Nazis did to the Jews. They had to dig shallow trenches, lie down, and then were just butchered in cold blood. It's estimated that 500,000 people fled from Mosul and have gone into makeshift terror camps. So ahead of these people, it takes us back to the times, or the trumpet, the fifth trumpet, people absolutely terrified at the rapid advance of these people. Now, how long they're going to last as a power, we don't know. Whether it's just a 5-day wonder. Remember, just over a year ago, we would have said Muslim Brotherhood were on the rise in charge of Egypt. Turkey was relying on them, Hamas was relying on them, and then suddenly, that all burst and went. Now, that might happen here because, of course, Iran is Shia. These people are Sunni, therefore Iran is very keen to get rid of them. Interestingly, the Kurds have taken the opportunity to do what they've wanted to do for a long time, set up their independent Kurdistan there, and want to join up with the Kurds in Turkey. And you see, back at the end of the World War I, when Britain and France carved up this area, they just drew lines in the sands, didn't take much heed of tribal allegiances and that. And the maps are being redrawn by the events that are happening. And it could well be that the central area remains under this ISIS power. The Shia government would retain, I think, Baghdad and all the rest of Iraq, and probably Assad will retain the region there. So it looks as if it could well be carved up in different groupings there. Now, where these people, the ISIS people, make their headquarters, we don't know. I have now taken Mosul, which was the second biggest city. Interestingly, what lies just over the boundary there are the ruins of Nineveh. Mosul is Nineveh. So where does this fit in Bible prophecy? Well, there is one prophecy which seems to be relevant, and that's the prophecy of Balaam, made, before ever Israel had gone into the land and before they had been scattered again. Balaam made these prophecies, and we know that the last prophecies that he made would very definitely take us to the kingdom age, and the ending was he looks on Amalek, takes up his parable. Amalek was the first of the nations, but his latter end shall be he shall perish forever. And we know that earlier he had called him Agag, Amalekite Agag, and the Septuagint says Gog, so a linkage with Gog, the latter day Amalekite. But it is just the closing that ships shall come from the coast of Kittim, shall afflict Asher, and shall afflict Eber, and he, Amalek, shall perish forever. Now we believe that when Russia does bring her ships down from the Black Sea through the taking Turkey so that she can bring all her ships down into here, taking Crete and eventually coming on to Cyprus and taking Cyprus, we believe that this probably could be the time when these words are fulfilled. And she goes by land and through Turkey to Asher, Syria, to take control of Assyria. And at the same time coming down into Egypt by ships and by land before coming back to Eber. Asher is Assyria, with the headquarters at Nineveh, and Eber, that's where we get Hebrew. Hebrew is a descendant of Eber. Eber means a crosser over, or the land on the other side of the river, and that's why Abraham was the Hebrew, because he went over the river Euphrates to this new land on the other side of the river. So it would appear that there is a need for Gog and his assembled forces to take control of Asher. In other words, it would, I'm no stronger than this, it would appear that that is a region that needs to be taken. We know at that time Iran is working with them, but he needs to send his troops to Asher, which would indicate that perhaps this ISIS power remains there, and it is its own little state in the middle there, and needs to be taken because it is hostile to Iran and it will be hostile to Russia, because being Sunni, it's allied with Saudi Arabia and these other nations, Arab nations to the south, who are part of the King of the South grouping. So it's interesting, as I say, I don't know whether they're going to pick Mosul as their centre, but it's interesting that if they did, that is Nineveh. That's just across the river there is the ruins of Nineveh. So, just looking at the situation at the moment, the predominant power, the major power in the region is Iran. Iran is very aggressive now that Britain and America are pulling out of Afghanistan. We know that they've got their troops and equipment already to go in and to take control of Afghanistan. They also want to take control of Pakistan. Now, in the past, they have been very strong across into Iraq and into Syria, and just in the past few months have rebuilt bridges with Turkey. Turkey, up to recently, thought that with Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and in Hamas in Gaza, that she could build bridges down here with the Muslim Brotherhood. But now they have been, as it were, wiped out and disappeared. She now sees the wisdom of working with Iran. So it may well be that Iran has that, but with a chunk out, which represents the ISIS in the middle of her. Now, to the south, we see the Gulf states, the 6 Gulf states. They're wanting to link themselves ever closer. They're planning next year to have a joint army of 100,000. And what Saudi Arabia wants to do is, again, the equivalent of what Russia is doing there, what the EU has been doing for a long time, amalgamating states, using their powers, combined together to form a bigger power, a trading zone, as well as a military zone. So the Saudis in the south are doing exactly what Iran is trying to do in the north and what Russia is trying to do up in the north, to build an amalgamation of those states. And it's in talks with Jordan. It wants to take in Jordan. It has been helping Egypt very much, with America, under Obama, not very interested in helping in the region and seeming to want to concentrate further over against China. Then the Saudis have come to the fore and have been pouring money into Egypt. And they would like to see an amalgamation of these nations. Now, the problem at the moment is Yemen. Yemen is a Shia as opposed to Sunni country. A lot of Al-Qaeda terrorism here. And again, with American help, the Saudis are determined to clear them out of Yemen. And Yemen is due in, it's next year now, 2015, to become a member of the Gulf Council. We shall see. But we know this, of course, is Sheba, so she does have to change alliances and come under the control of this grouping here. So we see this fascinating bringing together of the power to the north and the power to the south, as it was in olden times. And Iran, the main power there, and Saudi Arabia to the main power at the south. We know that Russia and Europe combined will work with Iran to come and lop Egypt off and to take Israel. That's Ezekiel and Daniel tells us that. Now, just very briefly on Israel. Israel's great problem at the moment, I don't believe it. Goodness. This is interesting. This is the cover of the Time, 2002. Is anti-Semitism on the march again? And in the 12 years since then, we can say with a very strong yes that anti-Semitism is on the march again. Europe, Russia, Middle East, around the world, anti-Semitism is growing and growing. So much so that these are just a few headlines. Europe, Jewish life unsustainable in Europe due to rising anti-Semitism. They daren't go out in the streets showing any sign of Jewishness. We know just recently there were 3 murdered, weren't they, in that Jewish museum. More than a quarter of the world is anti-Semitic. That's the Anti-Defamation League, ADL. The new structure of the EU Parliament worries the Israelis because there are so many fringe parties and extremist parties, anti-Semitic parties have come to the fore and won seats, that really worries them. And of course, with Hamas and Fatah joining together, that is a very serious problem for Israel, because Hamas is dedicated to the elimination of Israel. And despite all the fair words, that is the situation. And the little children taught, hate the Jews. They shouldn't be here. And so as far as Israel is concerned, it is a very worrying situation. And then here comes the Pope, and in front of which there's the Pope giving his lecture there. Now, of course, these have been painted by the Palestinians, nothing to do with the Pope, but no word of condemnation at all. And just see how they have taken the birth of Jesus, this is what it's supposed to represent. No context with the Jews at all. Jesus was a Palestinian, he wasn't a Jew. She's wearing a cross, and just enlarge it up. Then the baby is dressed, and Joseph is dressed in the keffiyeh that is so characteristic. Arafat used to wear that. This is Jewish. It's not a Jewish headdress. That's a Palestinian headdress. But not a murmur from the Pope that the Christians, the Jewish side of the Christian story, has been taken over by the Palestinians. And at Christmas time, they speak quite openly that Jesus was a Palestinian, Mary was a Palestinian. If you take it to its logical conclusion, then it was the Palestinians that put Jesus to death, but they don't think logically. And then the visit to the wall. We know that only a very small section of the security fence is a wall. It's only a wall where they have had problems with the Palestinians firing at the Jews on the other side, so they had to build big walls. But, look down at the little girl, she's being pushed forward with a Palestinian flag, so the photographers have this beautiful shot of the Pope there against the wall, and there the Palestinian flag, protesting at how the Jews treat the Palestinians. So when the Bible speaks of the nations coming against Israel, no surprise at all. And then beginning of this month, Abbas and the Pope and Perez went to the Vatican for a day of prayer. The situation hasn't changed since that day of prayer. But what is interesting, I'm interested to learn, that Perez, when he was brought up in the 20s in Poland, for the first 9 years, went to a Jesuit school. And that accounts for an awful lot, because he has been very favourable to Israel. He has been one of the foremost in pressing Israel to hand over parts of Jerusalem to the Roman Catholic Church. And now, I can understand why. There is this friendship that he has with them. Now, this is, I'm sorry, this is the only scripture I've got up, but this is exactly the situation that God warns us, or warns Israel, that what they're going to do is to make friendships with people that will not benefit them. And it's clearly talking of the kingdom age, because it's saying, in that day the remnant of Israel shall no more again stay upon him that smote them, but shall stay upon Yahweh, the Holy One of Israel, in truth. So this is clear the kingdom, and that word stay is to support, to lean upon. So we know who are the nations that are going to smite Israel, and they're going to be Europe, Catholic Europe, and Greek Orthodox and Russian Orthodox, and Russia itself are going to come. They're going to be treacherous friends. And we can see Israel making friendships with the Russia and the Vatican. And if they read their scriptures, they would realise this is folly. But, scriptures have spoken, this is what they're doing, and so it will all come to grief. Well, I've just got 2 more, and then that's it. I'll shut up. Interesting headline. Scotsit could lead to Brexit. In other words, Scotsit is Scotland breaking away. Brexit is Britain exiting the EU. What it said, if the Scots vote to leave the UK, in September, that could trigger a chain reaction which leads to the rest of the UK quitting the European Union. This is a threat British pro-Europeans need to take seriously, given that a Scottish independence vote is quite possible, though a yes still has less than a 50% chance. What I'm saying is that should Scotland exit Britain, obviously she'd have to apply to the EU, she would have to adopt the euro, have to be a different currency between Britain and Scotland. But Scotland sends 41 Labour ministers to the British Parliament. The Conservative have only one Scottish MP. So if Scotland disappears, then the Labour Party would be greatly diminished in power because they would have 41 less members. And that would alter the whole balance, give the Conservatives more influence. And the Scots are more pro-EU than the English are. So it was just an interesting indication. We don't know what it is that causes Britain to come out, but if, we don't know whether they will, decide to break away, that could precipitate the Britain leaving. And of course, just at this very moment, there is the great question about who's going to become the president of the European Commission. Jean-Claude Juncker, like most of the leaders, a very prominent Roman Catholic, he wants ever closer union, which of course Cameron doesn't want. And there's a great debate as to whether, because of a little obscure clause in the Lisbon Treaty, whether he should get the job or not. And again, I thought it was interesting that he did in 2006, he had the Charlemagne Prize for his contributions to the building up of Europe, according to the dream of the original founding fathers. So it looks as if he is going to be appointed. Cameron is going to be isolated, and no doubt this will help to make that break when Britain has another role to play. God has a more wonderful role for Britain to play, working with Israel, and how fascinating that Britain is trying to build as much trade with Israel as she can at the moment, so that's wonderful to see. But what we've got to bear in mind is that from the coming of the Lord Jesus to the events of Russia coming down and the Battle of Armageddon could be a period of up to 10 years, I believe. And so the nearness of the Lord's coming is so very close. And we can see there's still lots of loose ends to be tied up, but that can all take place when Christ is back with the household and when things carry on in the world, and building up so that these nations come against Israel. So the wonderful thing is, brothers and sisters, that God has a plan and purpose, and the Lord Jesus is carrying on the work of his Father has had from the beginning, calling men and women to put their faith and trust in him, and he will bring them to this wonderful kingdom, when eventually Israel will dwell at peace and be the major nation and the temple there, and from there God's laws will go to the ends of the earth. And a wonderful work awaits brothers and sisters in the kingdom age to guide and feed the nations with the right ways of God. So I'm just going to leave you, or just click on it, so in some of the cartoons which were quite interesting in the past few months. Thank you very much.